So I want to start out with a little bit of science, but it's not the kind of science that I hope will put you to sleep. And it's not the kind of science that you probably necessarily have seen before, at least not in this context. And so the first thing I want to talk to you about from a change perspective is something called the Kubler-Ross change curve. And it really deals with our emotional response to change. And so if I were to use the words shock, denial, frustration, depression, where have you heard those terms before?
Well, Kubler-Ross is actually with death. So this is kind of like when death occurs. So some of those beginning emotions are, yeah.
Right. So what sometimes people will talk about the Kubler-Ross, will talk about the stages of grief. And actually that the Kubler-Ross change curve is utilized in the stages of grief. And so you'll see a lot of ways that that's been integrated in what we talk about change. But actually when they started with the Kubler-Ross curve, it was specifically just talking about changes in our life, major changes in our life. So it didn't have to be around grief or death. But that's where probably most of us have seen this before. So just real quickly to help you understand what you're looking at, on the left-hand side of the graph is, if you think about the kind of morale or competence. So this is how I feel. The higher I am up on the chart, probably the more positive or energetic I feel about this. And also when we talk about competence, it's how comfortable I am with it, right? Along the bottom is just a graph over time. So one of the things that I always walk through with people is when we talk about change, and because this has been linked to things like death, quite often people think of this as what we do when we experience negative change. So like a death, or maybe we lose our job, or personal events like divorce, or any of those types of things. But the truth of the matter is that really any change, positive or negative, actually has us go through these same curves. So obviously, if we talk about something like a job loss, or even for some people, let's say your company comes and says, "Hey, we're doing some cutbacks. We're not laying you off, but we have to move you to a new role that you've never done before to keep you in the company." You probably, the first stage you're going to go through is shock, right? You're surprised at the event, it kind of catches you off guard. And then when you move from shock, the next thing you move to is maybe denial. You can't believe that this is happening to you. You're almost trying to look for evidence that it isn't true. I've had sometimes people will say, they kind of have to pinch themselves to make sure that they're not dreaming or having a nightmare, depending on what the change is. And then from there, they move into frustration. They're recognizing that things are different than what they were before. And sometimes this frustration even leads to some anger. And so there might be emotional outbursts or those types of things. As we move through frustration and we realize that not only is this real and that things are going to be different, quite often people move through a period of depression. And so this can be an area where there's what we'll call low mood or lack of energy, lack of passion for what they're doing. And it's quite often during this time period, during depression, that we get a lot of people that look at the change, and quite often the word they would use is kind of despair, right? Not only can they not believe that they're here, they're just not even really sure how they're going to get out of it. The next stage beyond that, though, is what we call experimentation. And so this is typically when people have realized, hey, nothing that I'm going to do at this point is going to change the position that I'm in. And so I might as well lean into this new change. And so they experiment with it. Sometimes as they lean into it, they have some successes. Sometimes they lean into it and they have some failures. But through that experimentation, they kind of learn how to engage with the situation. The next piece after experimentation is decision. So after I've experimented with this for a while, I realize I'm probably not great at it or I'm not comfortable with it, but I'm realizing that the only way to really move on is to move forward. This is typically where I make a decision to accept the new situation as potentially my new normal. And so with that, and we're moving through that process, I actually feel more positive about it. Doesn't mean that I love it, but I realize that, hey, this is something that is going to be part of my life, and I'm going to continue to move forward. And as time goes on, this is at some point, people move into integration. That not only does it feel like a new normal, but that they've actually got through enough of a repetition with it that the change has been integrated into their life. And they feel like this is kind of the new them. All right. So I said, I kind of gave you an example of the negative, but the same thing happens with a positive. So if we got interrupted all of a sudden during this video call because somebody walked into your office with a big check for $20 million because you won the lottery, many of you, the first emotion you would feel is shock. You'd be surprised, obviously, and even a little bit of disbelief. And quite often when those things happen, the first question people say is, "Are you serious? Are you kidding? Am I being pranked?" So there is a bit of denial there. Once they understand that this isn't a joke, you would think that people wouldn't go through frustration or depression as a result of winning a lot of money. But part of it is because things have changed, because they now have a significant amount more money than they used to have. And that means that there are new challenges, new people that are coming into their life, a lot of friends that now want to borrow a little bit of money. This frustration starts to happen. And if you've ever watched there are a couple of really interesting documentaries. I think Netflix has got one of them about people who have won the lottery and how many of them, if you fast forward 5 years later, their lives are actually worse than they were before they won the money. Mm-hmm. And so that frustration, that anger, the emotion, there's actually quite a bit of divorce that happens during these time periods because change has happened and I don't know how to deal with it. And so that can lead to depression and experimentation, decision, and integration. So the reason I show this to you is regardless of what kind of change you're going to take on, if it's significant enough that you have to try pretty hard at it, whether that's a leadership behavior, whether that's just, hey, I want to get healthier, so I'm going to go to the gym, or I'm going to eat differently, or I'm going to quit smoking. All of those are going to result in you working your way through this change curve. And the key thing to understand is everybody goes through each of these stages, but they may go through them at very different lengths. Some may spend very little time in some stages and a lot of time in others, where some others are kind of consistently moving through. And this was I was reminded of this recently when a company here in my area actually announced some layoffs, and obviously a number of people found out they were losing their job. And you would think, if everybody found out on a Monday, that everybody would be in a different or would be in the same spot throughout the next number of weeks until they were let go. And the truth was, there were some people in that meeting that went through shock, denial, and frustration within the first 5 minutes, spent a couple of days in depression, and then were like, okay, this is a new opportunity for me. I'm going to go out and find a different job. This is a new start. And they started working their way up the second half of the curve very quickly. There were quite a few other people that spent time in shock and denial for really a number of weeks. And so we can't really speed this along. If anything, as we are working through our own change, or we're helping other people work through change, it's a good understanding for an awareness perspective to determine where we're at and what we still need to work through or help others work through. Any questions on that change curve?
I have a question, Joel. So you kind of answered it, but I just want to clarify. So I have this exact thing, this change curve going on with one of my teams right now. And I feel like a lot of them, if not all of them, are still stuck in frustration. Mm-hmm. And you said, everybody moves differently and it's kind of hard to move people out, but are there ways as their manager that I can help them get past that frustration stage? It's just hard. I'm past the frustration stage because I have to be, Yep. As a leader, you have to move through. I went through all of these. It was kind of funny listening to your definitions of all of them. Totally went through all of them. But like I said, I can't get my folks to get past that frustration part, and it's making it difficult.
Yeah. So I think the best advice I have for you in the time that we've got is we can't really force people to move on, but in each of these stages, if you kind of look at the definition of this, you'll realize that there are some questions that are outstanding that kind of need to get answered for the person, for them to be able to move on, right? And so So on the frustration stage, a lot of it is they've recognized that things are different. There's probably some emotion around that. So for some people, it's just having somebody else be able to verify that they understand that they're upset or they're frustrated or they're angry, right? And that we're all kind of processing this as well, especially if it's something the whole group is going through. So not only recognizing, but kind of confirming that you see that emotion in them, that it's okay for them to be upset, and that you're there to support them as they kind of move through the process is one thing that can be helpful. The other thing, though, is the frustration stage. People can stay in there a long time when things are unclear. So they're recognizing that things are different, but they haven't necessarily put their finger on how much of this is going to be different and what's it going to look like in the future. Sometimes it's they have to be able to measure the cost of the change. And so even though sometimes I'll have people say, well, I'd kind of rather them be in frustration than depression. You move from frustration to depression because you realize that where I am now and where I need to be or where I'm going are quite a ways apart, and that's going to create a bunch of work, and it's also going to probably be hard. And so helping them understand the difference between where they are right now and where they need to get can also help a person process through the frustration stage. Does that help?
It does. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Good. Any other questions?
Is there a book or a resource, Joel, that talks about this topic? Because it is interesting.
Yeah, I would say there are a number of resources out there. A lot of this has been used in social psychology for quite some time and typically around the stages of grief. But there are a number of change resources out there. If you even look in some change management books, they will use the Kubler-Ross change curve as one of their pieces of helping teams through change. When we talk specifically about, creating new habits or helping people kind of lean into new behaviors, The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg is a great book and utilizes some of the same research here.
Thank you.
So the next slide I'm going to show you is going to look very similar. It's actually a different type of change curve. It's called the Sater change curve. And this is really, it's focused on a different piece, whereas the Kubler-Ross was talking about kind of our emotions and our competence or how we feel about how comfortable we are with it. The Sater change curve is really focused on the performance response to change. And so I'm going to give you it's going to kind of seem like a silly example, but I think most of us can follow along with it. Many of you at some point in your lives as a kid may have played basketball. And for some of us, we started when we were really young and maybe didn't make it very far. Others may have played all the way through high school, potentially even into college. But when we talk about this curve, I'm going to use basketball as my analogy because I actually have a story from my own life that fits this curve very well. So on the left-hand side, again, we're talking about performance. And so the higher they are on this, the greater their performance or the better their performance. And again, along the lower axis, we're talking about over time. Okay. So anytime that we have a change, if you look at where performance starts on the curve, typically when we've done something a certain way for a while, we know that when we give it a certain input, then I'm going to get a certain output, right? So if I go to work and I type a certain way on my computer, the way I've typed always before, I can type so many words per minute. And so I typically always type that way because I know that's what I'm going to get, right? So my example from basketball, as we go across this change curve, I want to transport you all back to my 5th grade year of basketball. And 5th grade basketball is important for a couple of reasons. One, it's really the first time, at least when I was a kid, maybe not so much anymore with all the AAU groups, but 5th grade basketball is really the first time you played competitive basketball. Before that, it was more learn how to dribble, learn how to shoot, kind of play some fun games that were painful for parents to watch because usually the score was like 3-2 after 30 minutes, and that was it, right? But in 5th grade basketball, we actually played up against other teams. There's a time clock. There was, it was supposed to look more like basketball. So in 5th grade basketball, I remember my coach coming to me and saying, "Hey, Joel, I'm working with all the different players on just things that they can improve on. And one of the things I noticed is you only dribble and shoot with your right hand. And so as we continue to play basketball, you're going to have to learn how to shoot with your left hand, learn how to dribble with your left hand. Because if you don't, it's going to create a problem for you going forward, because other people are going to know how to do that, and you won't. And so being my coach, I'm like, okay, I'll try. And so if I go to the performance curve, I had usually been dribbling and shooting with my right hand, and I knew that when I dribbled and shot with my right hand, I kind of knew what I was going to expect from that. But this left hand piece was the new part of the process. And so what do you think happened as soon as I started dribbling with my left hand and shooting with my left hand? Anybody have any thoughts? The first time I started dribbling with my left hand or shooting with my left hand.
Your skill went down.
My skill went down.
It was new.
Right? So when I was dribbling with my left hand, it felt very foreign. I was very slow. I was dribbling off my foot. And because I was slow, people could steal the ball from me or whatever else. So my performance immediately started to go down. And that got even worse when I started trying to shoot with my left hand. Because, of course, my coach said if you're on the left-hand side of the basket, you should shoot with your left hand because then people can't block your shot. And so I would dribble down really poorly with my left hand to the left-hand side of the basket and then try to shoot. And in the words of one of my teammates, I looked like a penguin having a seizure. It wasn't pretty, right? So and quite often I wasn't even close to making it. And so my performance, the more I pushed into the left-hand piece, it actually went down. And to me, I felt like a worse basketball player. And I got to a point in that process where I saw my performance continue to go down. And I realized that in the past, when I just used my right hand, I felt more comfortable. I felt more confident. I was scoring more baskets. I was able to dribble faster. And so I got to a point where which is marked on this curve, where what we call where scared people quit. And so I was scared because my performance was going down. I didn't feel confident. And so what I did is, in practice, I would work with my left hand a little bit to keep the coach happy. But when games came, I only dribbled with my right hand and I only shot with my right hand, because I knew if I did that, I would get back to the performance level I had expected. And of course, when I did that, I would shoot with my right hand, dribble with my right hand, feel pretty good in the game. And I really looked at the experience of trying to use more of my left hand as completely time wasted, and that nothing was gained from the process. What I didn't realize, and actually at the time, but by the end of the season, I was starting to see some of the things my coach had said come to pass, right? Other kids that could dribble with their left hand or that would attack me on defense on the left-hand side of the basket. And I couldn't do anything, right? And so I was actually becoming the basketball player in my head that I thought I could be because I was good at the right hand, but the rest of the team was getting better. And so I returned back to my normal performance, but the guys that actually had pushed through that dip, that were dribbling and shooting with their left hand and getting better at it, the more that they worked themselves back up that curve and practiced more, their performance actually moved them to a much higher level than I was. And so they were better. They were more productive in their basketball. They were more efficient with their basketball. They scored more points. They got more playing time. And so exactly what my coach told me came to pass. I just wasn't willing to go there because it was uncomfortable. And so if you're looking for a resource on this, there's actually a fantastic book called The Dip by Seth Godin. And it talks about when are the right times to kind of push through the hard work it's going to take to get much better at something, and when is really the right time to quit, because there are some times that we should quit based on the time and effort that we're expending. So this is helpful. If you start to overlay these two, you can start seeing why not only do we go through an emotional response to change, but there's also a performance response to change. And when you overlay those two, that could be a reason why a team starts to be frustrated, right? Or stays in frustration for a long time, because both at the time that they're processing that things have changed and they don't like that, they're also realizing they may have to be doing something different and they're not good at it, which leads to more frustration. And so these two curves actually interact with each other quite well. And so again, for us, it's an awareness. Where are we at on the curve for ourselves? Where are others at on the curve? And what do we need to do to help them get through the dip? And a big part of this is encouragement, reinforcing what we know about them. If we know that they can get there, and we need to tell them that we see that skill or ability in them. The other piece is to let them know it's okay to make mistakes and that we know that they're not going to be perfect at it for a while. But through more repetition and through them leaning into that discomfort level, that they are going to get better over time. So you guys have probably heard this quote before, but the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And quite often when I work with leaders, either in coaching or in training, when we talk about, you know, something new that they've learned or an area that they want to improve on, quite often what they do is they take it into their head, but they don't do anything different, and then expect that because they know something different, that now they're going to get different results. And so that's where really today, why we're going to push into this whole thought process of how do we build the habit, because habits, the more times you do a certain behavior. So for example, if I said I need to become a better listener, and so the habit that I want to create is that I'm going to actually listen to somebody for 30 seconds before I ask any questions, right? During a meeting, whatever else, or if somebody brings an issue to me, instead of jumping in and coming up with an answer, maybe it's that I want to ask a question so I can gather more information. That's a behavior, and the more times that we do that behavior, it becomes a habit, right? It's not just a one-time choice. It's something that becomes habitual and something that we actually start to do without thinking about it. And that's where we want to move with some of these leadership habits that we're going to talk about.